Good Monday morning. Welcome back, guys, to our last week of video lectures and new content. This week we are finishing the Vietnam War. Today is one of our last two lectures for the school year. It's hard to believe that we've already gotten to this point, but I'm going to lecture today over the Vietnam War. I'm going to lecture Wednesday over the Vietnam War. Tuesday and Thursday are days that you guys have discussion boards. You can work on your reading questions and vocab. And then Friday's your writing assessment, and there's no new content after that. So we're getting there towards the end of the year. You guys have done a great job. Let's finish up strong this week. So let's go ahead and get our notes out, and let's go ahead and jump into our notes. So where we left off last week was we talked about President Nixon and how he handled the war, and I thought you guys did a really good job on the quick write, talking about different ways that he tried to entice the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong into a surrender, but then how he also went against the American public and what he had told them and kind of expanded the war. You know, he expanded the war into Cambodia and Laos, and he started bombing raids, and he really increased American involvement, even though he was saying that he was going to end the war. So demonstrations increased on city streets and college campuses across the country. The biggest anti-war demonstration in U.S. history, the nationwide Vietnam Moratorium Day, took place. 2 million people throughout the United States in different cities, so like in Los Angeles and Washington, D.C., and New York City, in Columbus and Cincinnati, all these cities on the same day demonstrated against the war, all right? On this day, 250,000 people came to Washington, D.C. and marched on Washington, D.C. If you've seen the movie Forrest Gump, this is where Forrest gets up and he talks in front of the reflecting pond, and then he meets Jenny in the middle. He sees her. They run together. But something that was a little bit different at this was there were a lot of Vietnam veterans that took part in these demonstrations. So this is where you really see that unity for the war and what people believe in starting to go away, because you have soldiers who you would believe were all for the war because they fought in the war that are actually protesting against it in their uniforms. So there's a clear division in society. The protesters are those doves, and they're protesting the hawks, which they see Nixon and our military being. Another major incident that really shows how our society was so divided during this time was the Kent State shootings. Last Monday was actually the anniversary of the Kent State shootings. Students were holding a protest at the ROTC building on campus. The National Guard was called to end the protests. Things started to get a little hostile between protesters and the National Guard. The protesters were throwing stuff at the National Guard. Something exploded inside the building. National Guard thought that they were under attack by the protesters, and so they opened fire on them. And this is the first time that one of these protests gets violent between the two, and we start to see bloodshed and we see death. The National Guard fired on the protesters, killing 4 and wounding 9. If you actually go to Kent State University today, there is a plaque of remembrance for those protesters that were killed during the shooting. And there was a song actually made, I believe it was by Bob Dylan, about the Kent State shootings. Protests erupted on college campuses in cities across the nation. And as I talked about, Vietnam veterans were one of the most outspoken people because they had seen the horrors of war, and now they're coming home and kind of telling people about it. So the next 3 slides we're going to look at really show us, what was happening during these protests. So the first one, you see signs that people are holding up, get out of Vietnam now, law and order equals racism, and that's because, a lot of the soldiers were just minorities. Remember, a lot of whites were using that college deferment, and were also using their finances to kind of buy their way out of the war. If you notice in this picture, though, when you're looking at the people, you'll notice men with big beards, long hair, all right, that prototypical dove or hippie look that we talked about in the 1960s. You also see women that are protesting. So men and women are together because, remember, women are fighting for equality at this time as well. And so this is a chance for them to jump in and show that they are helping the men out, and then the men then in return can help them out with equality. The next photo, I think this photo really shows the difference between hawks and doves. There's a clear distinction. Obviously, the dove is the guy that is dressed in the Scooby-Doo turtleneck that is sticking the flowers in the end of guns, all right? And then you have the hawks that are the the military police, the MPs that are there, and you see the one guy taking the flowers out of the ends of the guns. And so you see the contrast there in society of the doves and the hawks. You guys probably have seen the movie Remember the Titans, right? Well, in that movie, there was a football player that comes in from a military base. And remember, that movie set during the time of the Vietnam War. His name was Sunshine. Sunshine had really long blonde hair. He came from California. He was a dove, right? You saw him out there. He's practicing Tai Chi out there on the lawn of the school and stuff like that. And in comparison to the kids that were on the team from Virginia, they all had really short hair. They were more hawks because it's more of a conservative state and things like that. And so you could see the difference just in that movie when they were showing racial differences, also the differences we see in society and beliefs between the war. Our last photo, there's actually two on this slide. You see the Vietnam War Moratorium Day in Washington, D.C. You can see the march down the street to the Capitol building. You see a common symbol, the peace sign, which was used by a lot of hippies and stuff like that. And then the other one, make love, not war. That was a big slogan that the hippies used. You know, you see the guy with the unbuttoned shirt all the way down, long hair, long facial hair, and he's also burning his draft card in it. So he is obviously protesting the war by showing that he isn't going to go to the war. All right. The Pentagon Papers raised new questions about the war. In 1971, a former Department of Defense official, Daniel Ellsberg, leaked top-secret study known as the Pentagon Papers. This revealed how previous administrations had deceived Congress and the public about Vietnam, particularly who? LBJ, right? He is the previous administration when it comes to Vietnam. So here we have someone in Nixon's administration leaking papers showing what or how poorly Johnson had handled the war. And there's some reasons behind that. Are they trying to show how Nixon's trying to clean up for him? Are they trying to show how Nixon's doing a better job? Again, we're getting closer to an election year, so there's a lot of motives behind this. Government lawyers want a temporary restraining order to stop further publication of these papers, which leads to a Supreme Court ruling. The New York Times versus the United States. The Supreme Court ruled 6-3 against the government and in favor of free speech. So what they're pretty much saying is because we did not declare war, you cannot limit the speech of people in the United States. So if someone happens to leak information, it's not the newspaper's fault. The newspaper can publish whatever they want. That is their right. If we had declared war, then the government could go in and say, hey, this is going to hurt our war effort. It's going to hurt the morale in the United States. So it'd probably be better if you don't publish this, that you keep this away from the American public. And that's well within their rights. But because we want to limit the government's power, and we haven't declared war since World War II, this allows the newspapers more freedom, allows people more freedom to speak freely on issues. Congress responds to a widening war. After the invasion of Cambodia, people were very anti-war in the United States. You know, they were okay for a while with us just fighting in Vietnam against the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong because we understood who we were fighting. We're fighting communism, right? But as soon as we go into Cambodia and Laos, it's like, well, wait a second. Are they communist nations? Well, you say they're helping the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong, but do you have proof? So it raises a lot more questions than answers for the American public. By the end of 1970, Congress had repealed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. Now remember, the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution is what gave us the power to get involved in the war. This is where the War Powers Resolution lies with the president. The Gulf of Tonkin Resolution gave the president power to send in troops, and they kept just allowing him to get more power. So they would just keep approving, hey, you can send more, hey, you can do more, hey, you can continue bombing, and they would set certain time frames. So they would say, hey, you have, 4 months, hey, you have 6 months. Then eventually, as it was starting to expire, they would have to repass it. So the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution has been continually passed for about the last 5 years. Now they are stopping it. So they're taking that power away from the president and they're putting it back in Congress. By 1971, Congress had passed a resolution not allowing U.S. troops outside of South Vietnam. And when Congress does this, this really prohibits us from winning the war. If we want to win the war in Vietnam, we have to take the Ho Chi Minh Trail. As soon as they tell us we can't leave South Vietnam, well, we can't take the Ho Chi Minh Trail in Cambodia or Laos. And can we get into North Vietnam and take Hanoi? No. So this is obviously a losing effort at this point. When Congress learns Nixon secretly bombed Cambodia, it passes the War Powers Resolution. Nixon's kind of a sneaky guy, as we would have found out if we would have been in the classroom, because we would have talked about the 70s and the Watergate scandal and him being kicked out of office. But the War Powers Resolutions place strict limits on the president's power to use the armed forces without Congress's authorization. So the president can use the armed forces because he is a commander-in-chief, but it's only for a certain amount of time or days. And then he has to get Congress's approval. So this could be like when President Bush sent our troops into Iraq and Afghanistan in retaliation for 9/11. He just needs Congress to approve it within a certain amount of time, or else his troops have to leave. So Nixon can start bombing Cambodia and Laos, but then after X amount of days, Congress has to allow that to continue to go on, or it then has to be stopped. All right, so hopefully that makes sense. Now, the last slide we have today, well, I guess we have a picture slide after this, but the last content slide, Nixon declares peace is at hand. Because of the failed Tet invasion, the U.S. is pulling back on bombing North, and the peace talks started to progress. Henry Kissinger proclaimed weeks before the 1972 election that peace is at hand. This is a great political move by Nixon, because he's saying, hey guys, peace is at hand, re-elect me, I can finish the deal, and then we're going to bring all of our troops home. The war is over, right? And so it's his way of winning re-election in 1972. And the people are going to buy this because he is a good talker, and people are believing what he's selling. This allows Nixon to win re-election in a landslide. South Vietnam's president, Nguyen Van Thieu, was afraid of peace talks and thought the U.S. was leaving him and broke all peace negotiations. Because you can't blame the South Vietnamese. They've always had a larger country there to help them. Now that this larger country is going to be gone, it makes them extremely vulnerable to the North and the Viet Cong to be taken over. Nixon ordered a series of B-52 fighter bombing attacks on Hanoi and Haiphong. These are known as the Christmas bombings. And on January 27, 1973, the Paris Peace Accords were signed, which made the 17th parallel the dividing line between Communist North and Democratic South. So one last bombing effort on the North to show that we were still serious in the war brings the North back to the peace tables. And what ends up happening, just like the Korean War, we divide the country into two. And if you look at it from the very beginning, this is how it was before. The country was divided at the 17th. The North was communist. The South was democratic. Here's the difference. After the war, we're leaving. And so, do you think the South is strong enough to keep the North and the Viet Cong out? No. So, unlike Korea, it's eventually going to fall, okay? Now, if we look at this real quick, we have one more slide. The bombs dropped in the two wars. We look at World War II and Vietnam. There's a drastic difference in the number of bombs that are dropped. When I'm talking drastic, I'm seeing almost 4 times as many bombs are dropped in Vietnam. Now, there's some reasons for that. Obviously, it's a war that lasts longer. But World War II is a war on 2 fronts, so you kind of double the time that we're involved in the conflict. The other thing, and the other reason why we drop more bombs, is we have air superiority, and our technology is far superior. So it is one advantage that we have. Plus, as a country, we are developing these at such a high rate, we can use this as an expendable tool, all right? And it decreases the amount of casualties we have because we're using less personalized war. You know, we're dropping a bomb out of a plane or shooting it from a ship instead of sending a soldier in with a gun to shoot the enemy. Okay? All right. That's it for Monday. I hope you guys have a great day. I will come back Wednesday with my last video lecture of the year. Last time you guys hear me lecture, rest of the year. All right? So stay tuned for that. Hope you guys enjoy your Monday. Continue working on your reading questions and vocab. And let's get ready for our writing assessment on Friday. All right. See you guys.